Welcome, everybody. This is our June 12th, 2021 forum on safe outdoor spaces. INC is always trying to bring topics that are relevant and of interest to neighborhoods broadly. And we've had a number of these forums. We tend to get really good attendance. And we record these for YouTube so that people who weren't here live or people want to refer back to it can. Today, we have a forum on safe outdoor spaces. These are places where our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness can stay in an enclosed, safe, and stable place, especially during the pandemic. There have been two of these so far, and two more being set up now, or one of the new ones has been set up. But we want to dive deep into this topic so that we really understand what it is, understand the purpose, understand the rules and regulations, and as neighborhood organizations that make up INC, understand the experience of neighborhood organizations and neighbors in the area where these safe outdoor spaces are. We have 7 panelists to try to cover the scope of this. Robin Kniech, Denver City Council at Large, will be giving us an overview of the need and where this kind of fits in the city's range of services that we need for housing and especially for those experiencing homelessness. Cole Chandler, the executive director of the Colorado Village Collaborative, his organization has been running the safe outdoor spaces and talks very specifically about how they operate, what they're for, and how it's worked. Tina Axelrad is the zoning administrator for Denver. So certainly these are not a typical use that would be covered by zoning. So how does zoning handle something that's atypical, we don't have a category for, and what are those rules and regulations? Then we have 2 leaders from neighborhood organizations, Travis Leiker, executive director of Capitol Hill United Neighborhoods, and Judy Trompeter, president of Uptown on the Hill, are leaders from RNOs where the first 2 safe outdoor spaces operated for the past several months. Tarasa Harlow lived right next to one of the safe outdoor spaces. So we'll get that up close perspective on how did it work. And then Mark Montes is a resident of one of the safe outdoor spaces. So we've got a great forum that can cover this from many different angles, but the core of our discussion is going to be Q&A. The way we're going to do that is first we're going to ask each of our panelists in the order that I have listed here to spend 5 minutes sharing their perspective on this topic, coming from their unique role that was outlined here. Then I have a few questions that I've prepared to send to many of them, and we'll be taking questions in the chat from you throughout the meeting. Now I'm going to do like I've done in the INC Transportation Committee, which I've chaired, and ask you as participants to propose questions in the chat. And then I'll be looking at the questions for ones that seem to be of broad general interest. Feel free to chime in if somebody asks something that you want to see asked. And because time is limited, we will be ending at 11:30. I'll be trying to get in as many of those questions as I can that are of broad general interest, and asking the person who proposed that question to unmute and ask the question in their own voice. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here and ask that we start with our first panelist, Robin Kniech, with her overview of safe outdoor spaces.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very humbled to be here. Most of the leaders who have made this happen are going to follow me, but my goal today is to set just a little bit of the context so you understand how this entire model functions in Denver. So I am going to share a few visual slides. So someone will alert me if you don't see a picture on your screen, but hopefully you do. So first of all, Robin Kniech, I'm one of your at-large members. I've been working on housing and homelessness actually since I was in high school. I worked at a shelter as one of my first volunteer roles, and worked with homeless women out of college who were homeless due to domestic violence in a shelter setting, and then have worked on policy since my 2011 election to council, working a lot on funding for these services and interventions. So that's kind of my background. And I want to just show you this visual because one of the first questions I get when I do community presentations is, what is Denver doing for people experiencing homelessness? And I show this visual because every single place on this continuum is a place that Denver is currently funding services and or providing services in partnership, mostly with nonprofit providers. We do own a couple shelters, but even those, we have nonprofits who operate them. No one starts at one end of this continuum and then moves through every step to the end. You might start, for example, you might fall into homelessness and you might immediately go to transitional housing, right? Maybe you get into Warren Village. You might start an emergency shelter and you might go right into permanent housing. We actually see a very high rate, 42% of the people we have put into supportive housing in our region over a 15-month period have come directly from the streets. So this is not a step-by-step continuum where you start at one step and you work up. You might go into any of these interventions. When I first created this visual, several of the items on this visual didn't exist. We had emergency shelter at the end. We had virtually no 24-hour shelters, right? We didn't have the shelters with services. We didn't have tiny homes. We didn't have safe outdoor spaces. So you basically had this emergency overnight shelter, and then you had kind of transitional housing over here. We had a few folks staying in motels, maybe families with children were our primary population staying in motels, but very few of those folks. I will just say that over the last 3 years, 4 years, almost everything you see from shelter with expanded hours to tiny home villages is newly provided by the city or scaled up significantly. For example, the motel stays significantly upgraded by the city during COVID. So I wanted to show you this. Let me show you. You see a sliver on the streets of people experiencing homelessness, but 3/4 of the people experiencing homelessness are folks we don't see, right? And so we focus a lot on that unsheltered group, and it's important because they're very vulnerable. But this is partly just about understanding that when we feel like we have failure, and we do, when any person is sleeping on the street, our society, our community has failed. But this context of where we're having success, most successes we have become invisible. When someone gets a key to housing, as more than 1,800 people have in the last couple years, they become invisible to us because they have a key in a door. We don't see them anymore. So these are just some of the numbers of the folks we're serving in shelters. And I want you to see this. 53% of the guests in shelters are Black, Indigenous people of color, which is higher than their percentage of population. I know Cole is going to talk about the fact that for those using safe outdoor space and those sleeping outside, the disparity is even greater. So we see a racial disparity in those using shelter, but we see even greater racial disparity for those who are unsheltered, which is why safe outdoor space was a piece of a key intervention. So just again, a little bit to show you, why aren't people in shelters? More people than ever are using shelters right now, but we have limits to the ability to be there. And I know Cole and others might talk about some of those barriers, whether it's being in a couple that's not able to stay together in shelter or other things. The other thing I want folks to understand is the spending. We have spent probably $60 million in emergency funds on shelter over the COVID emergency, but we are also spending money on rehousing and supportive housing. The number one question I get from those with concerns about safe outdoor spaces is, why aren't we putting people into housing instead? My answer to them is we are. You all voted for 2B, and those dollars really will be helping to put thousands of people, 1,800 new housing units will be built through 2B. I'm just going to show that slide real quick. Doesn't want to go. So just a few budget numbers on the city. I, can answer questions. I know I'm going real fast. I'm trying to stick with my time. But I want you to see here, we are spending money on housing. The challenge is that we get about, 50 to 100 new units in a project. And then we have more than 1,200 people probably sleeping outside. We have more than 2,000 people sleeping in shelters. You can see the mismatch between the size of a new housing project. So when we got involved working in a partnership with the providers, including Colorado Village Collaborative, St. Francis Center, other neighborhood and community leaders, My role as your council person was to say, I want everyone in housing, but while that's not happening, I have to ramp up the pieces and places people can go to fill a gap. And that is what we saw. We worked together to take this model to the planning department, who you'll hear from, to the mayor, to make the case that this was a critical intervention. So I'm here to answer questions a little bit more about the big picture, but I hope that for now, this gives you a little bit of a context of why Safe Outdoor Space stepped into a bigger continuum. We continue to fund all the other permanent housing and the other emergency solutions, but for folks who are falling through the gap, this was critical. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Next, let's learn about what the Safe Outdoor Spaces are. Cole Chandler, I believe you have a presentation. Great. If you take your 5 minutes to orient us.
Sorry, I'm Cole Chandler. I'm Executive Director of Colorado Village Collaborative, and Mark Montes is with me. He'll share some of his story a bit later on. So where Robin left off in terms of the gaps that we're trying to bridge is exactly where we start here. Safe Outdoor Spaces are intending to bridge the gap, just as she showed, between the streets and stable housing. And so I want to just provide an overview of what a safe outdoor space is, to provide some level setting so that we know what we're talking about. And so from the beginning, we have talked about this as a public health response. This is intended to keep people safe. It's intended to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 and to mitigate the impact of that as we carry forward. It's also an outdoor individualized sheltering model. And so when I invite people to envision what a safe outdoor space is, I ask you to take an image of a homeless camp out of your mind. I want you to think about something different. Just how it's been safer for restaurants to extend their services outdoors and to individualized ice fishing shelters and geodesic domes during the pandemic, that has been a safe way for us to serve people in church parking lots, in university parking lots, in individualized outdoor spaces. And this is also a 24-hour managed facility. And so we have 24-hour paid staffing around the clock that is monitoring the space and ensuring that it's running safely, that it's delivering on its goal of being a safe outdoor space. It's also a resource and service-rich environment that's designed to be all-inclusive and deliver everything that someone needs right there, right where they are. And so there's been 3 goals that we've talked about as we've advanced safe outdoor spaces. The first was to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. We've done daily wellness screenings. We've done monthly satellite testing. We've delivered 32 vaccinations to about 90% of the people that were in our safe outdoor space at that time. We've had a 0% positive COVID testing rate throughout this intervention. The second goal was to extend access to resources such as ongoing case management and housing access to people so that we could bridge the gap between the streets and stable housing. We're pleased to have delivered over 190 case management appointments, to have made 14 longer term connections to housing, to have a dozen people employed or enrolled in employment services. And so we're pleased to have delivered on that goal. And then third was to really think about this as well from a neighborhood perspective and recognize that we have a significant challenge with existing unsanctioned camps, and how can we better serve people and neighborhoods. And so we have this third goal of relocating people camping in public space into this resource and service rich environment. This is not just a model that Denver has stood up during the pandemic. Cities all across the country, East Coast to West Coast, more progressive to more conservative, large cities and more rural environments have all seen this as a pragmatic response to addressing the impacts of COVID. We're at really a breaking point in our nation in terms of the homeless response system. The 2020 point in time count showed that for the first time since that count has been conducted, there were more people sleeping outdoors than in emergency shelters across our nation. That's not the case here in Denver. We're pleased to report that. But all across the nation, we are facing a significant problem with a system that's bursting at the seams, and we need models like this to continue to come forward. So I just want to give you a sense of what a safe outdoor space looks like as we orient here. This is from the outside of the safe outdoor space that has now closed in Capitol Hill. If you look at this now, it's a vacant parking lot, but it was a place that was filled with life and many lives for 6 months. And so there's a fence all the way around all of these sites. There's a single secure point of entry with a key code that only staff has access to. Staff let residents in and out. They don't let guests come in. There's some individualized shelters, and then some larger tents for service provision, food provision, and staff and management. This is what the outdoor of the site that's being set up in Park Hill looks like right now. If you walk by on Glencoe, this is what you would see there in Park Hill. This is the brand new safe outdoor space that's just opened at Regis University. We have 56 shelters here and the capacity to serve 60 people. You can see some shade tents, as well as those food and service tents and a staff office, and that secure fence all the way around. When we look inside of a safe outdoor space, we see uniformity. We see everyone keeping all of their possessions inside of their individualized space. The space is kept neat and clean by staff and residents like Mark. And when we zoom in and go inside of a space, we see a cot, we see a sleeping bag, we see a personal storage bin, and a tent that's large enough for someone to stand up in and really spread out in and have the dignity that that provides. We also provide bathrooms and hand washing stations, as well as showers and laundry. And so just a couple more slides here. I just want to show you that the process for selecting residents, I can talk more about this, but it's a multi-step process that involves outreach workers going out and identifying people in encampments. It's not people walking up to just receive those services and get in. We prohibit lines and loitering outside and really go out and make direct contact to bring people in that are screened and willing to follow the community agreements. Those community agreements include what's shown here on the screen, really committing to be a good member of the community and promote safety for the residents as well as the surrounding neighborhood. Our staff is responsible for ensuring that that happens. And so that 24-hour staff is on site, enforcing guidelines, managing site upkeep, and creating accountability when that's needed. I shared some of these outcomes earlier, but we wouldn't be having this conversation if we hadn't seen some significant signs of early success at our safe outdoor space. 14 residents moved to longer term housing options in a 6-month time period. 12 people actively employed or enrolled in employment services, over 190 case management appointments, and 32 vaccinations delivered. I look forward to continuing the conversation here. So thanks for having me this morning.
Thank you. I know it's hard to cover so much in a brief time, but that was fantastic. Now let's look at the zoning aspect. Zoning is something that INC has long been engaged in through our zoning and planning committee. A lot of neighborhoods, rite of passage, getting involved in an RNO is learning about zoning. We have Denver's zoning administrator to tell us about how this unusual use is treated in the zoning code. Tina Axelrad.
Okay, can you all hear me fine?
Looks good, sounds good.
Okay, this is very quick, so I am assuming some level of basic zoning 101 knowledge amongst you. I apologize if this goes too fast, but we have lots of time for Q&A. My name is Tina Axelrad. I work for the City of Denver's Community and Planning Development on the development services side, which is where we do all the project review and permitting. And I am the zoning administrator responsible for overseeing that zoning permitting function and the overall administration and enforcement of the zoning code. So this came to us in the middle of a pandemic where we were seeing an increasing crisis in housing, and we needed to act quickly. But I want to assure everyone, while it may have seemed fast and from left field, this actually engaged a wide cross-section of city experts and professionals at the highest levels. We had engineers of all types. We had fire, we had building, we had zoning experts, we had public health experts at the highest level, all taking a hard look at what this thing was that was being put forward by a couple sponsors like Cole and Colorado Village Collaborative. And it also came on top of a previous 2-3 years experience with Cole's group as well on standing up tiny home villages as another alternative on that spectrum of housing and shelter that Robin showed you. So we did piggyback quite a bit on the lessons learned from the tiny home villages experiment, which ultimately were successful to the point that City Council adopted an amendment to the zoning code to permanently allow both temporary and permanent tiny home villages subject to permitting and limitations and review. So generally, the zoning code does grant the zoning administrator authority under the Denver zoning code specifically, and through a special city council ordinance that was adopted during the pandemic. So through those two efforts, both explicit authority and then special granted authority during the pandemic and now during our recovery, I am allowed to look at uses that are novel and new and don't squarely fit into a listed use type in black and white on the code, and make a determination whether that is a use that can fit into its particular context or zone district and play nicely with other uses, and then make a final decision whether to allow it, which includes how, when, where, who, what as well. And that's what happened here. We call these a use determination. They're all posted every time this authority is used on our Denver zoning code webpage, which is denvergov.org/zoning. If you scroll to the bottom, you'll see all the written code interpretations, determinations, and clarifications. And this use determination, and we called this use a temporary managed campsite during the COVID-19 pandemic, is up there. And that's where most of the detailed land use and organizational rules are. Now, you'll see a lot about zoning, but please be aware that for every proposal for what we're now calling a temporary managed campsites, it's a multi-agency review and permitting process. I put a quote up here that is being used to provide a bit of context and rationale. We have extended the allowance for these managed campsites. Originally, it was tied very closely to the emergency public health orders issued by the state and city during the height of the pandemic. But as we saw those orders being wound down as vaccinations began, we're still left reeling from the impacts. And this paragraph on your screen is from the host, which is our facility. And I'm sure I just killed that acronym, but let's call them host. They did a response report to what they had accomplished and done to address housing during the pandemic and looking ahead. And the fact is, we still have impacts from the pandemic that are directly follow the dots to people, the impact on housing stability from the economic downfall that we are still in. These are some of the limitations that you will see on the face of that use determination, and we've broadly defined it. And while what you're seeing here are the safe outdoor spaces that Cole's group has set up in the 4 sites to date, this also allows a similar type of managed campsite for people who want to sleep in their own personal vehicles. So it's a little broader than what you're seeing here, and we haven't yet permitted a safe outdoor parking campsite, but we are expecting an application for one in Southeast Denver any day now. So as I mentioned, the duration has now been extended to December 31st, 2023. It's allowed in every single zone district because we want to be able to take the opportunity to provide this important type of interim housing and emergency housing wherever an opportunity might arise for enough land and appropriate site. We do require a permit, and it does come with this mandatory pre-application step, and that's the step where we red flag any issues and cross the entire spectrum of public health and safety and welfare agencies. The applicant has to be a nonprofit or a governmental entity. When you are on private property and you're putting it up in a parking lot, there is an explicit allowance that if there's some required parking spaces that the zoning code has told the primary use on the site that they have to maintain, like a church often has to maintain a minimum number of required spaces. This overrides that on a temporary basis, and you can put your managed campsite on top of otherwise required parking spaces. Those 6-foot fences are explicitly allowed, and there is no minimum parking required for the actual managed campsite use. Another question that we get a lot is, what about the actual operation of the campsite? And what's been worked out quite a bit through the experience with the temporary tiny home villages and now with the first to Capitol Hill SOS is a pretty good idea of what makes for success and the ingredients for that in the day-to-day operation. And so as part of the zoning permit application, we do require the applicant to submit an operational plan that addresses all the things you see on the screen there, and then whatever else they want to tell us about what they intend to do. And when we do approve a zoning permit for one of these managed campsites, we make it a condition of approval that that operational plan be maintained, updated as needed, and complied with over the life of the project. And then finally, this goes with the applicant personally. You can't transfer it, so there's no bait and switch that could happen between operators. We would need to see it all over again and start from scratch. I think we've talked about the success and where those 4 SOS camps have already been. I want you to know, though, that in addition to just permitting, the city is committed to partnering with the applicant to ensure compliance. And so what we do, typically heavier at the front end and a little lighter over time, unless there are problems identified, is send an interagency group of inspectors from public health, from fire, from building, from zoning, from electrical. And they will go visit the site, certainly within the first 30 days, and then typically within the next 60 to 90 days. And if everything is going well, it'll be on a complaint basis or only as needed after that. With the 2 Capitol Hill sites, there were never any substantial issues, a couple minor public health items like please clean up after your dogs, and that was the extent of it. Just to show everyone a reminder, we do have 2 zoning codes in the city of Denver. I try to forget that every single day as the zoning administrator, but people keep reminding me. This does apply across both Denver zoning code land and also lands zoned under former Chapter 59, which are shown here. And that's what I've got. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn now to the R&O perspective. So we have Travis Leiker and Judy Trompeter. We'll start with Travis. Could you tell us kind of the history of when this came to you and all the way through to how it turned out?
Yes, thank you so much. Travis Leiker, President and Executive Director of Capitol Hill United Neighborhoods. I just want to say thank you so much to INC for hosting us this morning. So I would be the first to admit that I know that R&Os are deeply engaged in work around affordable housing and homelessness, but I would be the first to contend that maybe our organization has not been the most proactive or solutions oriented historically in terms of bridging the divide between neighbors as well as direct service providers in the city. But I think that shifted quite considerably in 2020 in light of the pandemic. So in the summer of 2020, it became clear that the pandemic and economic struggles were causing some significant concerns for us as an R&O, but the city more broadly, in that there was both a growth and a seeming expansion in unsanctioned encampments throughout Chun's greater boundaries, geographic boundaries that is, and not only that, citizen inquiries became more frequent. And so we discovered that after consulting with the city and the mayor's office, that many of those who were experiencing homelessness were not availing themselves to the services that were provided within the city. And so after fielding some complaints, a number of complaints from our membership, general inquiries from the citizenry and so forth, we started to put our brains together and worked with other R&Os, business improvement districts and creative districts to compile a list of, and it started as a list of complaints, but we like to lean into being solutions oriented. So we took those inquiries, complaints, and what have you, and turned them to actual strategies on how to address what we were observing, and both anecdotally as well as from a data perspective. And so Chun, along with Uptown on the Hill, R&O, Colfax Business Improvement District, and the Golden Triangle Creative District, put together an 8-point plan for the city to consider. And I'm just going to go through briefly those strategies that we proposed. And so item 1 was to bring your best ideas strategy, which called for an RFP process to help us as R&Os, but also the city, put together ideas and concepts that would otherwise be able to support those who are experiencing homelessness. We felt that there was sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to tackling this, and I'm so glad that Councilwoman Kniech pointed out many of the ways and priorities in which we are addressing homelessness today. And some of those were born out of this pandemic, and we're thrilled to see their efficacy. The next item was to bring comprehensive services to each site. And so we called for some flexibility in terms of whether or not we were converting a former church or dormitory into some sort of a housing service and program to safe outdoor sites. But all of those services, ranging from mental health to addiction recovery to sanitation support, all those things that Cole described, we called for as part of the overall plan whenever we were addressing these matters on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. We also worked regularly with the mayor's office and city council to get information around permitting and all the things that Tina just described. We also wanted to expand the potential SOS and temporary SOS opportunities in Greater Capitol Hill, but also in other areas of the city. We called for a clear point of contact, and then also maybe streamlining services and inquiries into the Denver 311. And so we received a relative positive response to this 8-point plan. And in doing so, our coalition of groups expanded from the 4 of us to Rhino, Old San Rafael, Curtis Park, City Park West, Santa Fe Arts, as well as Santa Fe Business Improvement District. And so in November of last year, we received word that 2 temporary SOSs were going to be proposed for Greater Capitol Hill, one at 16th and Pearl, operated by CBC, and then the other at 13th and Grant, operated by Earthlinks. And so we did what RNOs do best: convened neighborhood meetings, had conversations, worked with the direct service providers, engaged in good neighbor agreement negotiations, and we're pleased with the model of effectiveness. And so since then, going back to our 8-point plan, we and this growing coalition of RNOs, and by the way, we're always taking on more members and partners in this effort, we expanded upon the model of temporary SOS is calling for opportunities in each city council district, potentially removing the link of these temporary services from the COVID-19 pandemic, since we see a light at the end of the tunnel as it relates to the pandemic, but not homelessness. Incorporating temporary SOS sites into the wider context of providing services to the homeless. And then continuing on the theme of 1 point of contact. It's been pretty consistent from our perspective and from our membership that there still seems to be a lack of focus in terms of who do we direct these inquiries to. It's getting better, more work to be done, but again, like I said, we tend to lean on the side of being solutions oriented, and have had really great, robust conversations with city leadership to put together a plan of action. And so greatly appreciate, as I wrap, the work of Tina, City Council, Cole and CVC and their staff, because this is not easy work. And that's something that I have walked away with. I knew it was a difficult task going into this last year, but I have walked away with a greater appreciation for and admiration of those who are deeply ingrained in this work, because it is perhaps one of the most vexing issues at a city level, and we can't do it without them. And so we appreciate their partnership and collaboration and willingness to be great neighbors and great stewards of our community. And I think that that's, they've gone above and beyond the call of duty in that regard. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Travis. Next, let's turn to the other RNO we have represented, Uptown on the Hill. I believe the first safe outdoor space was located in your boundaries. And Judy, could you tell us about the process of establishing it and how it went?
Yes, the site at 16th and Pearl is in Uptown. The one at 13th and Grant is in Capitol Hill. But we work together all the way through with the RNOs and BIDs and so on to handle this, to be good partners in the whole situation. To start with, as has been mentioned, there have been many, many informal, unsanctioned encampments, particularly in Capitol Hill and Uptown and downtown. And that's why we started meeting last fall. We were all taken by surprise on November 2nd when the announcement of the 2 SOS sites was made. We hadn't had time to, we had barely gotten the word out that we were even in support of such an option, but we did support them right from the get-go. We had, first of all, included them in our letter to the mayor. We saw them as viable. Well, we saw them, we didn't know yet if they were viable. We saw them as a good, something that could be tried. At this point, it was in the middle of COVID. People are all over the streets. These camping situations on the outlawns are not healthy for the people in the tents, much less for the neighbors surrounding them. A number of people froze to death last winter living on the streets. So this isn't a good situation at all. Anyway, we spent most of November, particularly Travis and I did, handling calls, complaints, emails. Irate neighbors were very upset, and their thinking was, well, first of all, it got off to a difficult start. Someone in the neighborhood wrote an anonymous letter and distributed it wisely. I personally don't even read anonymous letters, but other people did. So it got off on the wrong foot in that regard. But the reasons people had for being concerned about this were, here was one of them. People would say, why us? Why do we have to bear the burden when other Denver neighborhoods don't have to even deal with encampments? Why locate these 2 new sites in Capitol Hill and Uptown, which are already dealing with fallout from the economic and political crises? Other concerns people had were the lack of forewarning, confusion between informal and sanctioned encampments, and the unknown. These had not been tried. People didn't know what to expect, had no idea whether they would work or not. We responded patiently and calmly 99% of the time. We had a few times we snapped. We corrected misinformation that was included in that anonymous letter. We explained again and again the reasons why we were in support of trying this. Again, we didn't know if it would work, but we thought it was worth a try. And we wanted people to give the SOSs a chance to succeed. Let's see. So we knew that the SOSs would be kept clean. There would be services provided to the individuals staying in them. There were porta potties, dumpsters, hand washing stations. The showers truck and the laundry truck would drive up a couple of times a week. We knew all that would be a great improvement over these informal encampments. So we saw them as a worthwhile, innovative option that should be given a chance. So our experience with them has been wonderful. We signed this Good Neighbor agreement that Travis mentioned. The Colorado Village Collaborative, the one that ran the SOS at 16th and Pearl, fulfilled every expectation listed in that Good Neighbor agreement. They kept the area clean. They treated the residents with dignity. They helped them. Many of them got a new start on life. And over the 6 months, they were at 16th and Pearl, at 13th and Grant. They fulfilled their promise and more. I walked by the one on 16th and Pearl every other day anyway, morning, noon, or night. And you could always tell there was life inside, but it was a good situation. There wasn't chaos. There weren't people generally hanging around the outside. And whenever there were people hanging around the outside, the staff took care to disperse them and keep them moving. The staff kept the neighborhood around the site clean. Let's see. So lately we have, well, during the course of the 6 months, we have heard from several different people who were opposed at the beginning, but who have changed their minds, who have said, this went much better than we expected. It's been an improvement in the neighborhood. And so they've had a change of heart. Cole's group put on a town hall once a month reporting on the activity at the site. And from the very first one had well over 200 participants on the Zoom call. And most of them were not happy with having an SOS in the neighborhood and were very vocal in their opinion. The last call that they had 6 people and they were all supporters. So you can see that things improved in that way. The bottom line for our organizations is that these homeless people are our neighbors. We can't continue to ignore them and hope they'll go away, because truthfully, where is there for them to go? That's our bottom line. And we are proud of the part we played, the tiny part we played in giving these a chance to succeed. And we hope other neighborhoods will do the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Let's go a little more micro. What is it like living across the street from a safe outdoor space? What did you expect, and what did it turn out to be? To kind of speak from this perspective, Tarasa Harlow lives across the street from the Pearl location. Tarasa?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I really admire everything you're doing here. Helping people to the best of our abilities is what we should all aspire to do. I really appreciate Cole and his team for making the continued effort to make Denver a better place for everyone to live and a happy and safe life. As a neighbor of the SOS on Pearl, I've had an up-close view of how the SOS worked for the neighborhood, and I could not have been happier. In the months leading up to the setup of the SOS, we had an unsanctioned camp directly out our front door. This camp brought a level of chaos to the neighborhood and made my neighbors and myself very nervous. But in the interim, I had spoke to one of the social workers that had visited the camp, and she informed me that most of the residents from the unsanctioned camp would be moving to the SOS. And this relieved some of the fears for all of us, as the sweep seemed to be ineffective at helping at any long-term solution. Once the camp went up, it was a night and day difference, even though the SOS was right across the street. You didn't even notice it was there. I never heard a peep from the SOS. And in the 3 months that I was observing it, I only saw emergency services there twice. And one of those times, the SOS had called for a person not related to the camp. So I don't know that the actual impact, but it was very minimal from our experience. While there were people loitering on the fence line most days, this has nothing to do with the SOS. This block of Pearl has always been busy with people lining the sidewalks. And since the camp has come down, the regular crowd of people is still there. It's just something being close to Colfax Springs. But while the SOS was there, you could tell they made an effort to combat that. I'm honestly sad to see the SOS go. It gave me reassurance that people who otherwise would have been living in a dangerous living situation have a safe place to go without fear. Where they could shower, use the restrooms, and have clean clothes and hot food. Another point is not having to pack their belongings up every morning and drag them around the city like they had to do with the shelters. And although I didn't see any dogs at the SOS, I'm happy to know that there was an option for that. So people didn't have to get rid of their beloved pets just to avoid rough sleeping. And if you've ever been in a negative situation, your dog makes it better. So to take that away, the last comfort that some people have just seems horrible. My main takeaway from the SOS was it was virtually invisible. There were more benefits than I could have imagined beyond helping people clean up the neighborhood. It gave us And I'm sure the residents hope that there is going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. And that if we all put our fears aside, Denver can be a place that works for everybody, regardless of income level, mental stability, any issues that we would not necessarily have to be unhoused to deal with, that now people can come together and help everyone. I feel like people worried that the SOSs were going to be drugs and crime, but that just wasn't my experience. If anything, I noticed a improvement in the issue that our neighborhood was experiencing. And if you didn't know the SOS was there, you wouldn't have noticed it. It just looked like any other Denver parking lot that's fenced. It is shockingly similar to the police station that's a block away. I would have zero issue welcoming another SOS. Again, super upset that it's been taken down. I think had it given the opportunity, it could have done a lot more for our neighborhood, but I'm thankful that they're continuing the project and it wasn't shut down completely. But thank you for listening to me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have to ask about my experience.
Thank you very much. To wrap up our panelists, we'd like to hear from Mark Montes. Mark is a resident of a safe outdoor space, and whatever you're comfortable telling us about your background and your experience before and then during being a resident of the safe outdoor space.
My name, like you said, my name is Mark Montes. I lived on the streets for 11 years. Most of it was around Josie and Colfax, York and Colfax, City Park, and then some other little spots around the neighborhood, like the rec center, let's see, Mako right there. So that's where my kind of the area where I was always, and that's where I was at. Then when I had the chance to meet the two outreach persons that talked to me, and they kept on me because they knew I didn't belong with the crowd I was with. And as they finally did wear me down, and like knowing like just maybe they're right, you know. So they told me about the SOS. I said, well, they're like, look, it can't hurt you. You could try it. And then so I was like, okay, let's try it. But since I went to the SOS and part, you know, what's called one on Pearl Street, I took the little bit of belongings I had, and I went there and got in. And then I at first, like when you go somewhere, you're real worried who you want to talk to, because if you don't know them, you know. But SOS is, they open their arms just like a big family would, you know. Wherever you came from, they still respected you. And I done a lot now, so I got me a job. I used to call it Quaker. I worked downtown for the CSG. I cleaned them all. I wear the purple shirts and all that. And then let's see, the next thing I have now I'm working on is my housing. So I have 3 options of housing that I got to do next Friday. And besides, like the people that want to tell them in Capitol Hill, oh, it was lovely. They were kind. Some would just ask me, you know, they would stop me and talk to me and say, hey, you having a good day? That was lovely. I still want to tell them thank you. And so now I'm still moving on. So it's just got to wait like a little waiting time on the, you know, housing list. But I'm getting there, you know. So I appreciate everything that all you guys are doing. I really do.
Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
Thank you for being here with us. Okay, we're now going to just take a few questions that I prepared that I think will be of general interest to INC, and thank you for all those who are putting questions in the chat. I'm compiling those based on themes that I'm hearing repeatedly, and we'll choose somebody to ask a question that was proposed, and I'll direct it to a panelist. First, I had a question just a little bit about good neighbor agreements, and whether it's Travis or Judy. Could you just briefly talk about some of the things you asked for in the good neighbor agreements?
I picked up on Judy's cue. Thank you, Judy. Sure, yes. So what we did was we hosted a number of forums, and out of those forums, we were able to gather a handful of what we perceive to be requirements or expectations of the neighborhood. So we asked for items such as hours of operation, to on-site security services, to sanitation services. We also thought that the expectation should be bidirectional. And so we committed as an RNO to be supportive through resourcing, neighborhood cleanups, and the like. And so for in the context of the 16th and Pearl, Capitol Hill United Neighborhoods provided some funding for block by block cleanup efforts. And then in concert, in cooperation and partnership with Uptown on the Hill, we provided funding for meals for those who were participants in the site at 16th and Pearl. And we did the same with respect to the 13th and Grant temporary safe outdoor site. And it was, you know, a lot of legal work and teams involved, but they're great, good neighbor agreements. And I say that not because we helped co-author them, but I think it was because we all came to the table with the intended outcomes of supporting those in need. And they're available on our website if you are looking for some reading over the weekend. They're great documents, and we really brought it together. So visit chundenver.org under Good Neighbor Agreements. You can take a look at those.
Great, thank you. It hasn't come up as a question in the chat, so I thought I'd just get to it since we teased it in the announcement of the meeting. Let's talk about costs. Cole, I think that the initial Safe Outdoor Space was funded via fundraising that you did, and with the success of that and really demonstrating the model, the city has participated with funding as well. But how do we think about that funding?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So the first two sites, which were launched in December, were launched entirely with private funds. We secured about $300,000 in private fundraising to get those sites up and off the ground. The Earthlink site operated entirely on private funds for the 6 months that it operated. Back in, I believe, February or so, City Council approved a contract that was brought forward by the Department of Housing Stability that provided Colorado Village Collaborative with up to $899,000 in reimbursable expenses to operate 2 safe outdoor spaces all the way through 2021. And so those funds will enable us to serve 100 people per night, an estimated 150 people per year. And so that's $899,000. The cost that comes out to is right under $25 per person per night to provide land and startup, to build the tents and the structures, to provide electricity and utilities. And the largest cost is the 24-hour staffing on site every single day and night of the week, and trying to pay people a living wage to do that important work. It also provides meals for residents and all those kinds of things, but $899,000 in public funds have been contributed. And I've heard some pushback on that. I've heard people saying, you know, that sounds like a lot of money for a safe outdoor space. And so I would point to the success that we've demonstrated, the ability that we've had to keep people safe. And I'd also ask people, well, how much does your single family home cost in the city of Denver? And it might be the case that your single family home costs around that same amount. For those amount of dollars, we're housing 100 people per night, 150 people this year.
Okay, thank you. Councilwoman Kniech, did you have anything to add on costs? Okay. I'm just reminded that back when Denver's Road Home vision for addressing homelessness and ending homelessness as we know it, identified the real but hidden costs of people who are living on the street and the services that are needed, whether it's shelters or emergency services, et cetera. So I think there's a perspective to look at there. Let's get to this topic of crime, fear of crime. We heard from Judy some of the concerns of neighbors showing up and circulating things that were very fearful. We had a question in the chat here. Let me find it. Sorry, there was a question. I forget who it's from, but it's a question. Reporting on DPD stats. Marty Harrison, do you want to ask your question? You can just unmute if you wish.
Yeah, I mean, my question was, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sorry, yeah, my question was just simply that I had heard that there were several calls to the SOS site, and then Robin addressed that, and I was just wondering if that is officially available or not.
Okay, so question about police calls. Cole, let's take first. What's been the experience of the first two site with the police being called to the site?
Yeah, I'll speak specifically for the site that we operated at Pearl Street, where we had 0 calls for police service to our site in the 6 months that we operated. I do know that there were a couple of calls for police service to the Grant Street site, but again, they were extremely minimal. There was an analysis done by Denverite that addressed the crime in the area around both the Grant Street and the Pearl Street site. It showed actually a decrease of crime in the direct area surrounding Grant Street. Around Pearl Street, it was neutral to a potentially slight increase, but my response to that is that that's not due to our site. That's just due to the reality of Colfax and Pearl, the tough intersection that we were at for 6 months' time, and a reality of significant drug trafficking happening right there on those blocks, and police being in the neighborhood and working to address that. So there's been no increase in crime. And we also have a third-party evaluation that's being conducted that will be releasing results later in July. And so I point people to that for further analysis on that topic.
Okay, how about a neighborhood perspective? I did see that Denverite story that summarized what can be known about crime in the area. Travis, Judy, or Tarasa, what's your impressions?
I can speak to just the overall presence in the neighborhood. Like I had said earlier, we had, for the 3 years that I've lived here, that block especially has been a drug haven. The drug dealers would normally stand at the top of the block, but because of police intervention earlier in the pandemic, that pushed them down closer to the church. Again, nothing to do with the site. I think the main consensus was trying to keep them from trying to infiltrate the site, but the site is gone and they're still there. So it had nothing to do with the SOSs. But as far as package theft or criminal activity, we have had a drastic reduction in that in the last 6 months. So I consider that a win.
Great. In that same article, Cole, you had an interesting comment. Because of the pre-existing issues in the area, especially that was just spoken about, you said to the reporter that you had to spend a lot of time keeping a bad element that was already there away, whether it's drug dealers, others trying to prey on those who are poor, and that another environment would help with people being safe and being a stable environment. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think Tarasa spoke to that by noting that, that drug activity has long been on that block, and now that we're gone, it's remained. When we were there, our staff every single day was walking up and down the sidewalk, moving people that tend to just loiter in that area and trying to push them out into other areas. So that was a part of the management of that site. And we're excited to be in other locations at Regis University and Park Hill United Methodist, where that's not a part of the day-to-day activity, so that our staff can really focus on delivering a high quality of services within the walls of our site.
We've had a couple questions I'm going to combine kind of into one, thinking about sites. We had a question about how much space is needed. We had a question about does this have to be privately provided space, or could it be city space? And then a question on where are people coming from who are homeless? Is this really just a downtown problem, or is this a city problem? Let's start just with what's needed for one of these spaces. Cole, how much land, what makes sense, given that it needs to be of sufficient size to invite in the services that people receive on site?
Yeah, in order to really serve the number of people that we're looking to serve in a safe outdoor space, we're looking at a starting point of 12,500 square feet for a piece of land. And so that's basically 2 single unit zone lots put together. And so on on that size, 2 single unit zone lots, we can house up to 40 people per night in a safe outdoor space.
Okay, Councilman Kniech.
Yeah, I'd like to address this question of kind of where folks are from. You know, I want to just share a story. I live in North Park Hill, and on my block is a faith-based homeless shelter. And, you know, North Park Hill has 3 major homeless shelters in the northern edge of the neighborhood. And I was once in a conversation, 29th Street in Central Park, with a prominent leader in the community who said to me, you know, we don't want, you know, people putting homeless camps in this neighborhood, and these things belong downtown. While I was talking with this community leader, an African-American woman came up to us and asked us for some money for the bus. And we started talking with her, and she explained that she was sleeping at the Coliseum at that time. This was during the pandemic when the Coliseum was a women's shelter. But that she used her bus money to come back to her neighborhood every day where she had family and network. So she pointed across the street to North Park Hill, just across the street from Central Park. I grew up right over here, and these are where my people are, and I need this. I go back and forth to the bus. She very much would have preferred to live near her community, but because the only shelter we provided for her was downtown. So I think this question of where people who are homeless come from, right? I will just say that the southern border of South Park Hill is Colfax. To say that there are not unsheltered people living near South Park Hill is to ignore the southern border of the neighborhood, which is Colfax. And so I believe that, and I'm an at-large representative, so I get asked this question, why us? Why this neighborhood? Why not somewhere else? And I will just share this perspective. Every neighborhood in Denver has a piece of service or hosting that they can provide. It might look differently. I can show you a map of where the supportive housing is, that permanent housing we described, which I will just share we get as much or sometimes similar resistance to as we do this solution, sadly, even though it's the solution people in this conversation say they'd prefer. So that conversation, I can show you a map, and it is in West Denver. It's in South Denver. It's right in Northwest Denver. I can show you a map of shelters, right? We do have a concentration of them in Central Denver, but we have one in South Denver. We have one in West Denver. Every neighborhood may not be a place for apartments, right? A lot of Park Hill is not zoned for apartments, right? But it does have these faith-based options. So this is why there are some faith-based shelters in our neighborhood. Some neighborhoods might be a better host for permanent housing. Some might be a better host for a faith-based, maybe a safe parking space. Tina mentioned there's an application in Southeast Denver for a safe parking space. So I think the question isn't, where are homeless people from? They are from everywhere, right? Eviction can happen to any family. I just want to mention one piece of the research. I get asked a lot, like, you know, what is the cause of homelessness? And this is my simple way of describing it. It is the collision between systemic inequality, right? Which is whether it's wage inequality, racial inequality, housing inequality, with an individual life circumstance, divorce, domestic violence, major car accident or injury. Those two things collide, the bottom falls out. And here's the question. If there's someone to catch you, a family member, a friend who has the wealth, has a lease or owns a house where they're allowed to put you up, then you're caught and you're not homeless. Everybody has a family member. Everybody knows someone who's had these things occur and someone caught them. The only difference between those who become homeless is that there's nowhere to catch. There's no catching of you. And so I will just say that this idea that people who are experiencing homelessness don't come from Park Hill, don't come from, you know, East Colfax, don't come from this part of town, or same with Regis, that they don't come from that area because they're receiving services downtown, right? We need to kind of decouple where someone ended up sleeping in an emergency shelter and who they are and where they're from and whether or not they have an opportunity to be served in a variety of neighborhoods. We will not solve homelessness if all of our neighborhoods are not involved, because we have too many people to serve in only a handful of neighborhoods. We will fail. So we have to choose. Do we rather have people in unsanctioned camps and alleys and parks? Would we rather each neighborhood find a piece of the solution that it can do, and it may look differently? So thanks for letting me chime in.
Thank you. So Cole, just, and I know I keep coming back to you, but I want to talk a little bit about this model that we've had forever, where so many of our services, not all of our services, but so many are concentrated downtown, which means whenever misfortune befalls somebody, they become homeless from wherever they are in the city, they go downtown because that's where we've put the services. In your safe outdoor spaces, understanding that it's this temporary model, it's not the solution, but it's providing something desperately needed. They're big enough in terms of number of people you can actually bring in services. I don't think you covered that very much in your presentation. Could you tell us about what people can get right there to help?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So we provide mental, physical, and dental health care services at our site, as well as wraparound case management that includes employment navigation, housing navigation, and benefit navigation. That's happening on our site 5 days a week, and that's how we're delivering the number of case management appointments. That's how we delivered vaccinations and have been successful in our COVID mitigation exercises. So we really designed this to be all inclusive. And sure, it is the case that a lot of the services for people experiencing homelessness are downtown. There's also a history of the way cities were built, of classism and racism that contributed to the ways in which those services were located in those areas. We are delivering services that are all inclusive and don't require those connections on a daily basis. We're also providing people with transportation assistance to get where they need to go when necessary.
Okay, we have a question from Florence Seaburn about the zoning administrator's determination for how these operate, not itself containing the 6-month limit. Tina, could you confirm where that comes from? Is the 6-month limit just something specifically negotiated per site, but not in the zoning limitations itself?
No, you just answered the question, Joel. Yes, absolutely. The authorization for the use provides an opportunity to set up a safe managed campsite for a duration of any length, but the authority itself expires December 31st, 2023. So if you were to find a private party willing to extend a lease term out to the maximum, we'd be looking at over a year, perhaps, for one of these SOS camps. But right now, between the landowner and the project sponsors, 6 months lease have been the norm. But I wouldn't necessarily say that's because it's required. It's just been what has been negotiated to date.
Okay, Jim Slaughter, you had a question about, you want to ask your question about this safe outdoor space residents.
Well, I mean, I've gone to some of the shelters and seen the shelving, that large bagfuls of belongings are stored, and I just wondered what the provision is for the SOS residents.
Cole and Mark, do you want to address where they store their belongings as residents?
Yeah, so residents are able to keep their belongings inside of their space. We do require that they stay within their tent. And then we can also make links and connections to additional storage as needed. But so far that need has not presented itself in a significant way.
I will just share that the city also provides several check-in storage facilities for anybody who's living without a home. They are not like a full storage unit for furniture and things like that. But if you have a backpack, for example, and you need to go get some services and you don't want to be carrying it all day, or if you are part of a city sweep or a displacement, those folks are supposed to be offered storage. We failed in some circumstances to live up to that expectation. But those facilities are run by St. Francis Center, and they allow people to store some personal belongings as well at those locations.
See, since I got a job, we're from the SOS and all that. I have my own little, I have a little storage that I pay for. So I really don't, I only keep the things I need at the SOS camp that I'm gonna use on a normal basis. But like if I want to put my good suits or something, I'm not gonna wear every day, like to a funeral or anything like that. I can go and get it at my time, you know, I can take it back and store it again.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Going on to the topic of temporary, we have a question from Tim McHugh about what happens when these spaces close. Tim?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yeah, since they last about 6 months, which is sort of the norm, but not the required, and most of the people don't find more permanent housing, do those people who have to leave go to the bottom of the list waiting for people or waiting for a site? Or do they just go to do they just move to the next site?
So during our relocation that we just went through from Capitol Hill to Regis and then to Park Hill, we offered every single person that was in the existing program the opportunity to remain in the program. And all but 2 people chose to do that and move across town with the sites. So we've been able to keep people in the program by and large over 90%.
That's great. I have an anonymous question. Somebody wrote to me and just didn't want to put their name on it, which is fine. What is the process for neighbors' involvement in choosing a site? So I imagine there's levels to this. Somebody has to own some property and invite this use of the property. But what is that process, and what is the neighborhood involvement, if any? Councilwoman?
Can I start here? I'm going to get a little bit big picture. So, I get questions about this, and like Tina said, we have to think just a step back from safe outdoor space to, generally speaking, in our country, in the United States, does one individual get to decide who can purchase, who can rent, or who can live next door, across the street, around the corner? And I will just say that, generally speaking, our private property principles don't allow one party to say who can buy, rent, or live around the corner. The one exception to that in our history was a period when we had racially exclusive or religiously exclusive covenants, where we said, I will put on this property deed that you cannot live next door, or you cannot buy this property. And my neighbor agrees to put on theirs, so that we both agree we're going to put this covenant on, and it will keep out someone who may be Jewish or Black. That history is the one time when there was a legal rule allowing people to say who could live next door. So we went ahead and struck that down. The court struck that down as discriminatory and contrary to our Constitution. So today, if you fast forward, you can look throughout our land use code, and these are a lot of neighborhood leaders and engaged folks on this call, but there may be a proposal about what can be built next door. We will see, do the rules allow that type of building or not? Is there a change in the rules? But we explicitly, as council and as the government, cannot think about who will live there. We can think about whether it fits the character of the neighborhood, right? Does the design meet the guidelines in the city? But we don't get into the who. And so the question becomes, if and when we have a public input process, what's the purpose of that public process? Is the purpose to take input on who we do or don't want to live near based on their income, based on their mental illness history, based on their race? We hope that we have moved past the decision-making based on the who, right? But it becomes confusing for neighborhoods when we have a process that says, here's a public meeting and you have an opportunity to comment. So here's my most simple definition of what we can do. Neighborhoods can have input on the relationship between a safe outdoor space in the neighborhood, or between a tiny home village in the neighborhood, or between a supportive housing building and a neighborhood. They can talk about maybe input on what they would like the security or the lighting to look like. There's been logistics conversations. Where will the door open? Where won't it open? Think about all the things that kind of interface externally. But what the processes, and I will just say this is not different for safe outdoor space. There is not a zoning process in the city that says I need my neighbor's permission for this land use. There's just not. That is not a thing that we do. And so this is no different. There's this opportunity for input. But when you look inward, who will live here, who won't? Generally speaking, that's not something that's usually dictated by the funding, right? Is this funding for folks with this particular challenge because we're going to have this service there? Or, the who is not typically an issue. What the rules are. It's okay to ask. I want to understand the rules. I want to see the rules. I want to see who's going to live there. That's transparency. But that's different than decision making about those things. So when it looks inward, that's generally not a place where people can make decisions about the who or the how, right? But all of those interfaces, those are the places the good neighbor agreements, the dialogue can help to shape the relationship, right? But none of that, and I will just say, we're not treating this use any differently. There is not a permission process for a typical land use. And there are good reasons why we don't allow neighbors to make decisions about who lives next door based on personal preference, right? So this is a really tough piece of our history, and it may not be that that's what people are intending, but when we substitute income for these other things like race or other backgrounds, they still sometimes have the same outcome, right? We saw already that more Black, Indigenous people of color need this service. So when we say we don't want someone of this income to live next door, it is in some cases going to have that impact, even if that's not what the individual sharing that concern feels. So I'll stop there, and I know others want to chime in. Sorry.
Are there other panelists who want to speak to this? How to locate a site, how to identify? Yes, Travis.
I'm not necessarily how to locate a site. I think it's because this is so incredibly complex. And I will let Cole chime in terms of how they identify the sites, but I think it's usually because somebody steps up to the plate and says, we're ready to open our doors to our fellow Denverites in need. But I do want to piggyback on what Councilwoman Kniech said. I think that like City Council in saying we're not going to say who can or cannot live in certain neighborhoods, but we can have a conversation around design, aesthetics, neighborhood fit, character, etc. RNOs have a similar duty. And I know we have a convening here today of many RNOs, business improvement districts and the like. And I think where we as an organization found our stride and then started, again, working with all these other RNOs, business improvement districts, creative districts, is we stopped the behavior of trying to make a determination of who gets to live in our neighborhoods and who does not, and rather, how do we make this a successful outcome? And that's our charge as organization. So it is through the Good Neighbor Agreement, it's through neighborhood feedback to say, we're gonna leave the othering others off the table. That's not what we do. And we're going to be solutions oriented. We're gonna make this a win. And we've done that in a couple of instances in the context of Chun with the temporary SOS sites at 13th and Grant and 16th and Pearl. But with respect to St. Francis Center and their new Warren residences at the former Warren Methodist Church, and it's working. And I think when you become, as an RNO leader, a purveyor of truth and facts and data, and you decouple, one's economic or health or life circumstances and strife from who they are as humans, and you say, how do we develop an outcome that's going to be a win for them as our fellow citizens, but also a win for us as a city? Because again, homelessness is a citywide issue.
Reading's almost over.
It's a citywide issue, and it requires citywide cooperation and solutions. And that's, I think, my charge as an RNO leader, and as well as my encouragement to all of you present on this conversation today, is to be the points of light for success and solutions. And in that regard, I think then we can have similar circumstances like the two SOS sites in Capitol Hill where they were a success.
Okay. I don't like being on panels and not getting questions. So sitting there waiting to ask a question, I want to open this continued discussion up to any other panelists who'd like to chime in. no pressure, but
I actually have a point to make.
yes.
I noticed there's a lot of hesitation to the neighborhoods that don't experience the unsanctioned camps to why should we accept a sanctioned camp when we don't have the problem and they don't see the homeless coming from their neighborhoods. And I can understand the hesitancy, but unless you live in that bubble and you say you're Park Hill and you don't ever leave Park Hill, yeah, I could see how that doesn't affect you. But if you want to go to a ball game downtown or out to dinner or go up to the mall, which is struggling right now, addressing these issues in 6-month time span with every neighborhood contributing is what's going to get us closer to the finish line of not having to experience this huge need for them. But I just think if we continue to hesitate to do our part, we're never going to be able to resolve the issue, and you won't be able to go downtown and enjoy those things. And so it would be helpful to say, okay, for 6 months, I'm going to pay attention, but I'm going to allow this to happen or not be mad about it and see what happens, because that's the best thing we did was just be open to the idea of, you know, all of these people getting these services that otherwise wouldn't have experienced it, whether it's through hesitation from going to the shelters or, like someone had mentioned, couples can't be in the shelters together, or animals. And a lot of it, and from my perspective and the homeless people that I've talked to, was through being handicapped. So a lot of the downtown services don't allow for people in wheelchairs. And if they do, it's not ideal because they have to line up and wait in lines for hours on end. And then it's just a physical issue with laying on the floors and the mats most days, or if they don't get in line soon enough, they get turned away. So I feel like if we all just continue to keep an open mind, we would be more receptive to what we're actually seeing as a benefit, as opposed to, oh, this is something that's bad that's happening to my neighborhood. Because in most cases, I think the councilwoman said, we're all one issue away from experiencing homelessness, and whether you have a safety net or not, I think we need to take that into consideration. But thank you.
Thank you. I see Judy is raising her hand.
I think we humans have a tendency to break ourselves into us and them, you know, we're better than them or whatever. And we're all the same, as Robin Kniech said. Some of us are caught when we fall and others are not. And I think we need to remain humble in the face of that. I think all of the decisions that have been made politically over the last many decades are what have led us to this position anyway. The cutbacks in constructing affordable housing, that was chopped off a long time ago at the federal level. Mental health and substance abuse funding was eliminated. I think it was all the way back to the Reagan administration. Let's see, in our own city, we tear down, I mean, it's just obscene how we tear down old buildings, many of which are inexpensive housing, inexpensive office space, inexpensive retail space. And then we put up these luxury buildings. Everywhere you turn in our neighborhood, there's a luxury building. I don't know who can afford them. What was the other thing? We also have allowed builders. There are some rules on the books that I'm not well informed on, but I know there are rules that developers are supposed to include affordable housing in their developments, but they're allowed to buy out of that. Well, now we don't have affordable housing because of that. And I want to say to all the other neighborhoods in Denver, as Robin said, there are homeless people throughout the whole city, or people on the verge of homelessness throughout the entire city. The entire city's decisions are what led some people to not have a safety net. And I lost my, it's up to all of us to repair the situation with our tax dollars and our support. And I want to say too, that at the rate that fences and boulders are being put up on all of the outlawns in the central city, people who are homeless are going to be pushed to your neighborhood and be camping on your outlawns, because we're blocking, not we, but a lot of people are blocking them here in the central part of the city.
Thank you. We're going to stay focused on the topic of safe outdoor spaces, but since it was mentioned, requiring larger developments to include some affordability, there's some legal changes regarding that that are newly possible at the state. Could you briefly mention that, Councilwoman Kniech?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing it up, Judy. So for the last 20 years, it has been illegal in the state of Colorado to require someone to build affordable rental unless they were getting money or land from the city or something of value to us. I couldn't ask or require the average developer to do that. And so we do have a fee per square foot instead of building on site because of that law. The legislature, I'm grateful to announce, has passed a bill that reverses that decision. It will go into effect in September. Denver is already discussing what kind of law we want to adopt now that we have the ability to do that. It will generally be, I'm just going to share with you nationally, between 10 and 20% is the national average of what these projects can bear. Because if you require too much, the project won't get built and you won't get the affordable units. The second piece you should know is that this is generally for moderate income households. It is a piece of the puzzle because if you have stability here, then you're less likely to fall when something happens. But it is not a direct solution for homelessness, but it can help to create stability that prevents more people maybe from falling into it. Maybe teachers, preschool teachers, the people who took our blood and did tests during COVID, all those healthcare workers, those types of folks are the ones that this housing is designed to serve. So that process is called expanding housing affordability, and you can follow along. And I'm sure INC will be getting a presentation if you haven't yet on that. So just wanted to let you know that that law has changed, and thank you to our Denver legislators who led.
Thank you. Yeah. And I really appreciate you starting with the spectrum of need and the spectrum of housing types, because all of these are happening simultaneously. Returning to safe outdoor spaces, there's a lot of questions on the theme of the impact that this can have. We've talked about personal impact, and we might revisit that a little bit more, but we see all the tents of unstructured homelessness, increasingly, of course, during the pandemic. Cole, you were giving a presentation the other day, and I heard you quote Denver's point in time numbers, trying to get a handle on how many people are experiencing homelessness, how many of those are experiencing homelessness on the streets, they're unsheltered, and putting that in perspective of what safe outdoor spaces could do. Could you help us connect those dots?
Yeah, thanks so much, Joel. So I think, when we look at this giant system and when we look at the great amount of need, it can sometimes feel hopeless. But what's giving me hope is the reality that the 2020 point in time cites that 1,000 people are experiencing homelessness. We have only had safe outdoor spaces in Denver for 6 months. And in a couple of weeks, we will be serving 100 people per night in safe outdoor spaces. So that means in 6 months' time, we've met 10% of the need. If we continue to provide resources, if we continue to provide land, if we have more neighborhoods that are willing to say, yes, we will take this on, we will do our part to bridge the divides, we can continue to grow that and make a significant dent on the unsheltered homelessness population. So that's what's giving me hope. And then in 6 months' time, we've met 10% of the need, and we can continue to expand as we move forward.
Councilwoman Kniech, does that meet your understanding of there's a larger point in time number, but then there's the smaller number he mentioned that are unsheltered?
Yeah, so I will just say there's really three numbers. So Cole is referring to the number of unsheltered people, which we're assuming is something over 1,000. We don't have a great count, and we won't this year because of the pandemic canceling that day of counting. The second number is the total number of people experiencing homelessness, well over 4,000 people. Both of those are one-time numbers, today, a snapshot. We have another number, and it's a sobering one, but it has hope built into it. Over the last 1 year, the Metro Denver Homeless Initiative, really our providers in the Denver metro area served 30,000 people, 30,000. We think probably about 20,000 of those were probably based or coming from Denver, right? So that's a really sobering number. It means a lot of people fall into homelessness, but you know what else it means? Because we don't have 20,000 people that are homeless at one time, it means a lot of them come out of it quickly. This is, again, the piece of the story that no one can see because you can't drive by it on the corner, right? And that is that those rapid rehousing dollars we spend to get someone an existing unit, right? The vouchers that are coming from the American Rescue Plan for housing vouchers, the supportive housing, those solutions are working. So many people are falling into homelessness and then coming out of it. So we are serving 20,000 people in a year, but only 4,000 at one time. So that means that we have two jobs, right? To continue serving people and moving them out. And we do have a lot of the folks that are using the safe outdoor space might be what we call chronically homeless. They've been homeless for a long time. But we also have, all of the need to stop people from falling into homelessness so that we slow the growth. And that's the eviction prevention work that we're doing. It's the housing stability rental assistance that we're doing. So those are just a little bit of perspective. I know the numbers sound startling, but the hope is, the good news is that we have a lot of solutions that are working. Every single thing we've talked about today is about scale, right? Scale. Why aren't more people moving out of the SOS into permanent housing? Because those units aren't open because of the housing shortage. They are. I will just say there's a question about our folks staying stuck there. And Cole already shared, you might have missed it, the earlier numbers about people who've already moved on and out into other solutions. And that does create room for new people who this is probably the only intervention they're going to take unless it's housing. So I just think that this big picture is about finding that hope and finding that success, even if your eyes can't see it, right? If you need help finding those stories, let us help provide them to you. But the models are working. The issue is the scale, and the issue is those systemic issues Judy mentioned, which are continuing to allow people to fall in. I can house, right, 1,800 people, but if 2,400 more are falling in, I'm falling behind, right? So this is the full, if maybe we're ending where we started, which is that it's about that full picture. And if we lose hope, right, that's for people experiencing homelessness, the SOS might be hope. That's the first thing it represents, that someone cares and that there's a chance. And for us as communities to say we have hope, neither can give up, right? Someone on the street, we don't want them to give up, and we can't give up. And that piece is what will help us continue to make the systemic changes, right? Everything we've described is a local intervention, but we need those big systemic changes to keep those 30,000 numbers and eliminate them.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it is impressive that of that completely unsheltered population, this is already helping such a big portion of that with only 2 simultaneous sites as part of this bigger system. Councilwoman Kniech mentioned the term chronic homeless. People have been homeless for a long time, like Mark. There may be an overlap with, of course, other issues in addition to money. Cole, who is coming to safe outdoor spaces? And is there a perspective that people who've been homeless for a long time, that is, they weren't helped by the services that Councilwoman Kniech talked about to rapidly come out of homelessness, are they connecting with housing? What evidence do we have that people want to move to a better place?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joel. So just to speak at a granular level about the populations we're serving within safe outdoor spaces, the chronic homeless definition, it means someone's been on the streets for longer than a year or had 4 or more episodes of homelessness within a 3-year time period. 60% of the population we're serving at Safe Outdoor Spaces is chronically homeless, but another 40% are people that are newly homeless, that have become homeless within the last year. And you might have seen a story in the Denver Voice about a gentleman named Alan who lives in our Safe Outdoor Space. He was living in an apartment building 3 blocks away from the Safe Outdoor Space that we opened. He actually came out and volunteered with us and helped build it. He lost his housing because the rent got spiked on him, and he moved into a Safe Outdoor Space. 40% of the people we're serving are people that are newly homeless. But then, there's also this narrative or this idea that people living on the streets, especially unsheltered people, they don't want to be in housing. And I'm here to say that that's simply not true. Denver has an innovative project called the Social Impact Bond Project, which found creative ways to finance housing. And there were 250 spaces that were made available through this model. They went out and found the 250 most costly utilizers of emergency rooms, detox, police and jail visits. So the kinds of people that we would typically think of when we're thinking of someone that's homeless that may not want to be in housing. They went and asked 250 people to come into housing, and only 1 person declined. The reality is that people want to be in housing, and that is what we need to continue to build and develop in order to address the crisis.
Thank you. That's great perspective, not only on who's in these new safe outdoor spaces, but the most chronic in some sense, the people who've consumed the most services and were reached out to by the previous effort wanted housing. There was a question early on from A&R Strickler. Sorry, I didn't get to that, but it had, I think, at root to do with this notion that do people want housing? And before they can get housing, a lot of people who've been homeless for a long time need first stability. Cole, I'm going to go back to you one more time. The other day you were on the Brother Jeff show, and you told a story about a man who hadn't removed his shoes for a long time, and what just stability meant from him. You have to be stable before you can move forward. Now, that was a story you shared in a public forum. Would you be willing to share that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when people come into the Safe Outdoor Space, I typically hear that it means a couple of things for them. It means stability, it means peace of mind, and it means hope. And so for that particular gentleman, this was someone that they'd been living in an unsanctioned encampment. And the day that he moved in, he told me he hadn't taken his shoes off in 3 months because he was always on watch. He was always on guard, ready to respond to whatever came his way. When he came into the Safe Outdoor Space, it was just this simple thing that he could take his shoes off because of the stability and the peace of mind that it provided him. He could trust that he knew who was going to be coming in and out. He could trust that the staff was managing the space in a good way. He trusted the relationships that he had with the people around him. And for him, that meant all the difference. And it meant the new hope to be able to move forward and think about the next steps in his life.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we need to, we're talking about numbers, and we also need to stay connected to individuals to know how they connect. Carol Hunter, you asked a question quite some time ago about INC. Do you want to ask that here? I know, Carol, you might not be expecting to be called on. Hi.
Hi. No, I was doing something else. That's one of the benefits of a Zoom meeting. Listening and multitasking. And I just want to say thank you to everybody on this panel. Wow. We have I'm the board of directors for Central Park United Neighbors. And we have a meeting on Tuesday, and I'm going to be sharing this. And I'm just very excited about all the information that's come forward. But I'm really about action and specific action. And so I'm wondering, as a person who's on the board of directors for a Rhino, how we can come together and collaborate around specific actions. And I addressed this a little bit earlier in the chat with Travis, and so I'm going to be communicating with him because he also has given me some great information today. But I just want to put that out there to the delegates. How are we going to come together, collaborate, be organized, and take action and keep doing it, keep doing the work.
Yeah, and I think broader, how can RNOs, if they know of a space in their areas that would be appropriate for a temporary outdoor space like this? We've heard about how they operate. We've heard about the screening and the stability. Can find more locations. INC could be a clearinghouse for this. My hope is that that this video that's produced from this session can be something people refer to, and we'll give contact information at the end for the RNOs that have been featured here, Councilwoman, and of course, Cole Chandler with his organization, Colorado Village Collaborative.
So I agree with you about that. And just let me say one final thing. I think the
Please.
video is invaluable. And that needs to be shared with as many organizations, individuals, I mean, not just in Denver, but throughout the country, because this is an issue that we're concerned with nationally. So again, I just appreciate everybody, but again, it would be nice to, if we could get like a group going and we can share some very specific things that we can do on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. Yes, Judy.
You can do what we did at the start of all this months and months ago. Drive around your neighborhood. I was amazed going up and down the streets in Uptown at how many vacant parking lots there were. Now, it turns out none of them, they were all for profit and didn't step forward. But look, it'll give you a different way to look at your neighborhood as seeing potential sites. And if you have nonprofits, churches, and synagogues and so on in Central Park, that might be, might have, like the Park Hill United Methodist Church, I think their site is almost perfect. It's somewhat secluded. It's bordered by an alley on one side, the church on the other side, and then the fencing, of course, will provide some discrimination between it and the immediate neighbors. It looks like an almost perfect site. And I think you'll probably find some of those in your neighborhood. I also there was something else. So what was it? I guess I'm just encouraging people not to be fearful of the people who stay at the sites. They have had their troubles. We've all had troubles. But as go back to the not being caught part, they weren't caught. Some of their problems they brought on themselves, but we can all relate to that. We've screwed up many times ourselves, haven't we? Each one of us. So I think if the RNOs are supportive and encourage the neighbors to discuss things, and you have more time than we did, so you'll be able to kind of get more organized and hear out what the questions are and be able to answer them with the experience that has happened in these two neighborhoods.
So Judy, thank you for that, because I forgot to add that I think one of the other values in this video with this panel and the discussion is that demythologizing a lot of things that we think we know about homelessness, and really we have to get to know, and I've been thinking about, the empathy that is required and the perspective and the shift we need to have around who is homeless and why. And if we can absorb that, if we can accept some of that and be re-educated about that, I think that's going to go a long way. So I really appreciate that coming out of this 2-hour session as well. So thank you.
Thank you. We do have about 15 minutes left. I'm continuing to pick from questions. I want to acknowledge something that Carol said, that she was taking advantage of this format with Zoom. We can not only have the live conversation, we can have the chat. I'd like to call out some folks, including Benjamin Dunning, who've been very active in the chat. He's with Timber Homeless Out Loud and has been talking in the chat about zoning and different aspects. Other people have been able to go back and forth simultaneously. So while we will have this video, if you come to the meetings live, there's multiple levels of conversations going on. Along the idea of as other places, as neighborhoods and property owners find space that might be appropriate for this. Given that today this is funded $25 a day per person, which doesn't seem like a lot for all that's being given, but by the city, would there be funding from the city or from various programs coming to the city from the federal government to expand these if locations were found? Councilwoman Kniech?
Yes, Joel. I think the short story is that we do have funding that is flexible enough to be used for this. So I just want to make clear our three big funding sources in the city. One is the Denver Housing Fund, which we created in 2016. That is only for permanent housing. So it cannot fund safe outdoor spaces or some of these emergency solutions. The second source of funding, the voters approved, thank you to the voters, 2B was passed in 2020. That funding is flexible enough. It can do emergency solutions and housing. So some of those funds would be eligible. And then the third source of funding that we have is federal dollars. And so I think that we did not use federal dollars initially for this solution. It was newer at the point, the federal money kind of comes with strings. It's confusing. Sometimes we had the money before we had the rules. It was a little bit of a crazy year, but I think we'll continue to explore whether federal funds can be used. They certainly can be used for some outreach services, even if they can't be used for like the restrooms and the fencing and the logistics. But we'll keep looking at it. I think, our biggest challenge is finding sites. And frankly, it's challenging to have to move every 6 months. So a site that's able to serve folks for longer, right, is the site that's going to be more stable and more financially efficient for everybody. So I personally would fight to do what we call a supplemental or a new city investment if we needed to do that. I can't speak for the agency that administers the dollars, but I'm hopeful that they would be very open to proposals. What we need is those types of sites that can make it through the process. In terms of public land, I answered this a little earlier in the chat, but the short story is some of the initial proposals were on city land. Those require council approval because they require a lease. That council approval can add 4, 6, 8 weeks to a process, so it can slow it down. It also introduces politics, which is unfortunate. But I think that, where we have more strong community support, understanding, information about the model, maybe now that it's been tried a few times, right? Those sites were before anyone had tried it. I think Judy and Travis both mentioned it was harder when no one had ever seen one. Now that we've seen one, maybe it would be easier, but those would be the barriers we'd have to overcome to use some city land. The other challenge is that a lot of the sites that we looked at early on did not have people using them. Churches were not having in-person services. They didn't need a parking lot. Rec centers weren't open. They didn't need a parking lot. Now that we are in this weird place where things have reopened, but the economic impacts of the pandemic are going to last for 2 years, some of those parking lots are now filled up. And so we will have fewer of those types of options without impacting services for people. So we're trying to balance those things, but I am hopeful and I would be very supportive. My answer is a safe outdoor space should go on any location where the logistics can be met and where people can be served for the longest period of time, whether that's a year or 9 months, 6 months. But until people are housed, we shouldn't be turning down any viable site. But that's my personal view. And it takes a longer conversation with each community and each council member to get to the public land piece. But I'm hopeful, so we'll keep working on it.
Related to the politics, Councilwoman Kniech, there was a letter, and I'm not going to remember the specifics of it, signed by some but not all council members asking for locations to be located throughout the city, found for these sorts of spaces. I've since anecdotally heard that some council members who were not signatories to that letter, having seen, experienced, heard about, probably visited these safe outdoor spaces, are more supportive than before. Is that your sense of your colleagues?
I believe there is a strong support on the council. I think it was maybe 10 or 11 council members that we had sign letter in support of the model. Not every council member submitted sites, but many did. Some just logistically didn't work. We had zoning code barriers. Tina is picky, I gotta say. There's a debate in the chat about whether she is. She's very picky. Lots of sites didn't make the cut. Lots of sites didn't make the cut because they didn't have water or electricity or things that the site needed. So there's a lot of logistical barriers. Not every site that council members proposed could work. But I will just say that, like, council members are people, and like all of us, the idea of something in theory versus the idea of it being next door are different experiences emotionally. And there are different experiences as you learn about something at a different depth. And so that is I mean, I'm hopeful again that we would have a better and different experience with public land going forward. But I think each council member is going to have to hear from members of their community who believe that this is a better alternative than folks sleeping and human waste on the sidewalks in the alleys. You know, those are your choices right now, right? We have those 1,200 people, we don't have a housing unit for all of them. And unless and until we do, which do we prefer? Members of council need to hear from folks that this is a better alternative, and that's going to help us.
Thank you. In the last 10 minutes here, I'm going to try to rapid fire get a few more questions, and some of these are going to be more specific. Marty Harrison asks about accountability for residents. So what are the rules that are operated under? Cole, I see your video's off. Are you here to speak to that topic?
I am, yeah. And I was thinking about just pulling up this slide on my screen over here, because I'm sure Marty's not the only one worrying about this. So, or wondering about this is what I meant to say. So here's the basic guidelines that everyone's asked to uphold. So you can see that list there. One of the questions that Marty asked in the chat was also, are people sort of required to work on their housing plans? And so I wanted to point that the basic agreement that everyone signs on also says, hey, I understand that this place isn't forever, and it's supposed to be a stepping stone, and it's going to be something that I'm going to commit to making strides to work on my next step. So that's a part of the agreement that everyone signs onto when they move into the site.
Okay, and then I'm sorry, when the screen goes away and comes back, it moves everything around on me. A lot of what we hear about folks who find the safe outdoor spaces helpful are people for whom the existing shelter system doesn't work. They have a pet, or they want to stay as a couple. Now, shelters aren't perfect, but moves have been made to make shelters 24 hours rather than people being kicked out and then standing in line again. That's certainly a lack of stability. A little broader than safe outdoor spaces. Whoever could answer this, Councilwoman Kniech perhaps, are steps being made to make shelters, which are an emergency service, more accommodating to more people that have otherwise been left out on the street?
Yes, I also answered this in the chat, and I want to be respectful of time, so I'll go quick. But we, first of all, making them 24 hours. The worst thing about shelter before the pandemic for neighborhoods and residents was lines. You had to stand in line because the shelter opened at a certain time, it closed at a certain time, the bus took everyone somewhere else for the meal at a certain time, and you had constant churn. You couldn't, you didn't know where to put your stuff because you couldn't leave it there during the day. You had to walk between a shelter that was open during the day and one that was open at the nighttime, but they weren't the same shelter. Making something 24 hours just allowed everyone to breathe, like the shoe story Cole described, right? My stuff stays under my bed, and I can come back to this bed after I go to my doctor's appointment, or after I go do day labor for the day, or after I go see a family member. I have a bed. I can breathe, right? No one can solve their challenges and affect their life if their nervous system is freaked out, right? First of all, so nervous system calm. Secondly, we added health services. We added 3 meals a day, right? We added some of those other pieces that just made it a more humane environment. I don't want anyone to think this is luxury. Even during the pandemic, you're sleeping 6 feet, and it was only 6 feet we could get from someone else's head or their feet, right? You are in a room with 50 or 100 people, in some cases 250 in our larger shelters, right? This is still shared bathrooms. It is still the lights turn off when someone else tells you that they're going off, and they turn on when someone else tells you they're turning on. Your individual power and decision-making is still highly limited, but certainly better environment. We saw a 60% increase in shelter usage with these changes, right? But we didn't see everyone come inside because of those things I mentioned. Still very, if you are someone who has a trauma because someone came up behind you and attacked you one time, having someone behind you in a 50-person room is going to be stressful, and you're maybe not going to be able to sleep in that environment. So those barriers still exist. What do we need to do next with shelter? I put this in the chat. $2B are going to help. We need to make them more accessible to people with disabilities. Someone mentioned that. You can't use a wheelchair in every one of our shelters yet. More culturally responsive. We have Native Americans who are homeless at 8 or 9 times their percentage of the population, and we don't have great culturally responsive programs for them. We still have more services we can include. We still don't have enough housing counselors. We've added a few, but we need more housing counseling in the shelter so that it is not just a place to save your life, it's a place to change your life. So we need more of those services. So 2B will help us continuing to improve those services. Lots of work yet to do, but at least some ground covered this last year.
Thank you. With that looking forward comment, I'm going to ask each of the other panelists to go around and maybe just 1 or 2 sentences and wrap up. Where do we go from here? That's the theme that I'd like you to speak to. Can we start with Cole Chandler?
So here's where I'd like to invite us to go from here. There's 1,000 people that are going to sleep on the streets of Denver tonight, but things simply don't have to be that way. We could work together across communities with neighborhoods to make mass unsheltered homelessness a thing of the past. And that's the invitation that I extend to neighborhoods to work collaboratively with us, to help us find sites, to work with council and with the mayor's office to continue funding these and to spread this dignified solution across the city.
Thank you. Tina Axelrad.
I would just say, you know, the city in its workforce and in its both its political appointees as directors of different agencies and departments and our civil service staff, that we remain committed to working across neighborhoods and with housing operators and proponents to think as creatively and inclusively as possible, and to not automatically shoot down new ideas, but to welcome them and to work through issues and challenges with an open mind and experiment. A lot of these things start out as very limited, fairly contained experiments where we do cut some slack, but then we're watching, and if things go well, the route can be to something more inclusive and more permanent in the future. We'll see.
Thank you. Travis, where do we go from here?
Well, with respect to city council members, for those who may be on the fence as it relates to this SOS model and other solutions, I encourage all to call them, engage with them, and encourage them to be solutions oriented and, frankly, to be courageous. I think there's an ounce of, you know, fact, data, and information that goes into this, but there's also a lot of courage. And my colleague Judy and I can speak to what it takes to be courageous in the face of some pretty strong headwinds. RNOs need to be solutions oriented on this matter and others. We can't approach things in an adversarial way any longer, because when you go into your own corner and you are unwilling to have conversations, things don't get done, and we have to get work done. And governance is hard, and it's supposed to be thoughtful and productive and not adversarial. I would call on RNOs that aren't present on this. I mean, there are a couple of groups that I think are noticeably absent. They should be a part of this conversation, because sometimes what you don't know can hurt you. And we need to lean into facts and gather the information. So I call on other RNOs to engage Cole and his crew, as well as Councilwoman Kniech and others, to find the information and get the information. And here, let's sit down at the table, decision-making table, to make the work happen. And then finally, I think, again, just assumed innocence. You know, one of the things that I observed with respect to our own engagement was there were folks that were approaching this with, you know, this is happening in the dark of night, you left us out of the loop, or you're doing this in the cloak of secrecy. That's not the case. This is hard work. And I think we need to approach this with the fact that many folks, whether it be Tina, Cole, Councilwoman Kniech, et cetera, are doing the best that they can with the tools that they have and the resources they have. And it's time for us to hit reset on how we engage as organizations with city leadership and with direct service providers. So it's time to hit reset on that dialogue.
Thank you. Judy, where do we go from here?
Well, in response to that question, I would like to I would like to comment on what one person wrote here and answer her different questions. She said that it isn't dignified to place people in tents like a cage, and that we need more permanent. She's saying a hotel is a better solution, and the city has recently bought one. I totally agree. These are temporary answers to a crisis we're facing. These SOSs are temporary. I don't consider them to be cages. There is support in their dignity provided to the individuals who are staying there, stability and safety, as we've talked about. And they are connected to mental health and addiction services. So those are good things. I think, and she says some people can't, for whatever reason, take in living next to or adjacent to these sites. I would encourage her to hang in there a little bit, give them a chance. And I think she'll find, as everyone in our neighborhood did, that this is a good solution, a good temporary solution for the crisis that we're facing throughout our city.
Thank you. Teresa, where do we go from here?
So I would like to just see more engagement with residents and the homeless. I think out of sight, out of mind is becoming a real issue in Denver. So we're pushing them to the outskirts, and with the upcoming playoff games at the stadium, we know that anytime big games happen, the sweeps tend to ramp up in those areas. So these people are going to get displaced farther out. So that's going to become an issue. So I just, maybe a conversation before this happens about where to put those people in the interim so they're not getting shuffled around as much, because once they get swept into these nicer neighborhoods, they have a lot more backlash, and so then they're getting swept immediately again. So it's this turnover rate that is just on a massive scale. And I think hopefully we can address that before the game and see maybe a better change in these people's lives, as opposed to just being like, oh, out of sight, out of mind. So I don't know if that could be a conversation for the next one, or so be it. But hopefully we in Cap Hill also vote on another SOS so that we're continuing to help the people in our immediate area as well. So thank you for having this.
Thank you. Mark, what are
Yes.
your thoughts as we end?
Yes, I have one. I just want to say one thing. I think if we all unite together, and then just instead of just like dividing each other or falling away from each other, I think it would be a better place if we all work together and just trust it. I trusted it, and it's got me a job. Like I said, I work downtown, Street Mall. I work in a purple shirt, and I'm just waiting on my housing. I'm keep doing my thing, and I'm gonna be moving out of there. So,
Thanks, Mark.
you're welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen here just for a couple final thoughts. Here's some contacts, places to start. The department that oversees this inside Denver is the Department of Housing Stability, HOST. Britta Fisher sent her regrets that she couldn't attend today. She had some planned travel. These are some contacts for folks who were here. I'm proud to be a part of INC that has recognized the work of the Colorado Village Collaborative in the past with an award, and then during the pandemic with financial support, along with other, especially food banks throughout the city. These are hard. We have multiple overlapping crises. Homelessness is one of our crises, and we need to work together. We need to think of ourselves as one people as we take a look at each tool we have, evaluate how well it's capable of being used and where to use it. And I'd like to just end with one quote. Paul Farmer, co-founder of Partners in Health, which is an international health organization, said, "The idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong with the world." Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. And so I'm back on. So I just want to thank our presenters again, because this was an incredible panel. So all of you, thank you so much. Give them a hand. Thank you. Thank you also to all those who participated, and thank you for all your thoughtful questions. And hopefully we have some of them answered, but now you have contacts, so that you can reach out and ask specific questions. And I think, all those panelists, I hope you're okay with receiving questions. I think we will have an ongoing conversation about this. And I think, I can't remember who came up and said INC should be talking more about this. We will continue discussing it. We'll see what we can do. Like I said, like Joel said, we did honor the Colorado and Cole and his organization, and we have provided funding for some food banks across the city of Denver also during the pandemic. So if you don't know that, we've tried to work on issues that have been directly impacted, residents of the city of Denver. So we'll continue working on that. The other thing to note is that, again, as people have said, the moratorium on the rents, there'll be more people experiencing loss of their housing and becoming unhoused. I deal with people every day who say, oh yeah, my mortgage is in forbearance. People are not looking at that. People in your community that you may not know in your neighborhood are probably going to be up against, if your mortgage is $1,500 a month and you haven't been paying it for, 10 months, you're in the tens of thousands of dollars. There are a lot of people who are going to be experiencing, homelessness. We haven't talked about, and I appreciate Rob and Kniech talking about, the spectrum, and there's spectrum of trying to find housing. You look at other kind of federal funding for housing, and also on that spectrum, there are people who live with family members. They're not living on the street, but they're living with friends, their family. That's a short-term solution. They don't have housing long-term, and they may be out on the street too, but they're trying to stay in their own community and stay in a place where they can have housing to keep their kids in the same school, to stay in their neighborhood. So again, like, I love what you said, Travis, is going back to the solution oriented. We in our individual RNOs and as part of INC, we should be looking at solution oriented. And so we all want to hear more. We all want to talk about more. So I really appreciate the conversation today. And again, it will be on the YouTube channel. Joel, the other question we've had is, I think we have all the slides and the from everyone. If we can put that on the website also.
Okay, I will ask the panelists to send me the slides. They were sharing their own screens today, but I'll ask
but
for that.
if panelists, if you can send your screens again, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I don't know if there's anything else today, but we can adjourn. I don't know if we have anything else. There's been a lot of thank yous for people, and I'm sure there's more questions. So Joel, thank you for pulling this together. Thank you all your panelists again. And again, thank you all of you for being here today. Thank you so much.